Hi everyone. We're gonna wait probably a couple minutes, like 3 minutes, just to see who else pops on. Also, anyone can feel free to put on their camera if they want to, but you don't have to.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
And then also, I'm going to be recording this just so our members can see it in the future. And for accessibility reasons, Zoom doesn't do live captions, unfortunately, but if you record it, it does have captions. So if you're uncomfortable with your video showing up, I don't think it should show up in the recording, but I'm just letting you know if you have your video or voice on that might be in the recording for others to see. All right, so I'm gonna start the recording and we're gonna get started. Okay, so today we're gonna be talking about late diagnosis of neurodivergent assigned female at birth persons. And Jamie's gonna be talking to us. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. And Jamie, could you give us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate Juliet setting this up and being able to have a conversation. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I am based in California, and I founded Equilibrium Counseling Services, which is an adolescent teen mental health center. And a lot of my work has kind of pigeonholed down into neurodiversity, ADHD and autism specifically, very much so after my late diagnosis. So I'll tell you a little bit about kind of my path to this, and then also like clinically what I've seen and noticed there. I super like feedback. So if you have questions throughout, please feel free to like write them in the chat and Julia can ask them, or there's not very many of us. So if you want to like raise your hand or there's like a little button with it, feel free to hit that and we can kind of have a little bit of a back and forth. Yeah, that's kind of my like little like tagline. I'm a therapist.
Awesome. Can you tell us more about your journey with late diagnosis?
Absolutely. So I am 33. Yes, I'm 33, and I was diagnosed at 31. I can look back now on, I was diagnosed with ADHD, but now the more I get into it, I wouldn't be surprised if it's ADHD and autism. There's just such an overlap between all of the neurodivergence that I think it's a little bit hard to tease out sometimes from one to the other. But I received my diagnosis after a huge life transition. I had a big change in my life within my family, and I started having decreased cognitive functioning. And I went straight to medical, and I was checking my thyroid and my hormones and had an EEG and like all these things to try and rule out like what was going on with my brain. And then one day it kind of like clicked. I have been working, sorry, my brain's jumping all around already. I'm a little excited. I'm like, okay, where's my story start? All these pieces fit together. Let me demonstrate and advocate and say, okay, here's my scattered brain for you and how it still works. So looking back when I was a young girl, I can now see some of the things that were labeled as anxiety or depression were actually my inattention. Looking at some of my perfectionism and my hyperfocus, and my anxiety and depression started when I was in like 3rd or 4th grade. Like that's when I first went to therapy, and I had lots of emotional breakdowns when I would get overwhelmed, overstimulated, and I would just crash and burn out. I think for me, it was missed a lot because my hyperfocus and perfectionism showed up at school. So I had straight A's. I was in the gifted programs. I overdid it. I would stay up till 2, 3 a.m. to get every single assignment done and get everything right. And so nobody identified it in school, but I was having all of these emotional symptoms. So I was getting depression and anxiety diagnosis. And so, of course, I then wanted to go study psychology because I was so interested in why people think the way they do. And it's now looking back that I'm like, oh, teenage Jamie was trying to understand her neurodivergence or how the neurotypical world worked because it didn't make sense to how my brain worked. So I got my bachelor's in psychology, and then worked in a therapy office and got to see the magic and how the success stories of what therapy and self-advocacy could do. So I got my master's in clinical psych. But college was really hard. It was really hard for me to get through. At that point, I had some questions. I was like, oh, I wonder if this is an attention thing. I wonder if I could have ADHD. But then the stigma and the stereotypes popped into my head. I was like, no, you're just not trying hard enough. Yeah. No, you just have to focus more. Well, literally, I couldn't. Somehow made it through, C's get degrees, but I made it and was able to continue with my master's. And then I've been working with an adolescent psychiatrist who specializes in ADHD and autism. So I've been working with the neurodiverse population for like 12 years. And I was just like, I'm just really good at my job. I totally get the patients. I know stuff. And then come to find out, oh, Jamie, you get them because you are. Like, this makes sense to your brain. And that's why I was connecting so well with so many patients. But so when a couple of years ago, when I had the life transition and my cognitive function decreased, I was trying all these routes to figure out what was going on. And then one day I did an assessment, and I was just everything this patient was saying in front of me. I was like, yeah, I get that. Me too. But like internally. And then I went to the doctor that I worked for, and I was like, could this be ADHD? And he like stepped back and he looked at me and he was like, yes, that makes a lot more sense. But we never noticed it because that's where my perfection and hyperfocus was. And once I had that understanding, it was like my brain clicked and switched gears, and all of the negative self-talk I'd had my whole life just flipped, and it was like ADHD. And I would laugh about it and carry on. So instead of beating myself up about it or shaming myself, that switched. And I just fully changed my hyperfocus into research and understanding and reading and talking with other neurodiverse people and really understanding how this shows up for us. And it's become my passion. And in my practice, I specialize with teens and adolescents, and my whole motto has been, be the person you needed when you were younger. And for a long time, I thought that was because the emotional distress I was in. And now I'm understanding, no, neurodivergence is so misunderstood and misdiagnosed that part of my role is to help earlier diagnosis. So I know we're here talking today about diagnosis, and specifically in assigned female at birth, because we're not diagnosed at the same rate. The percentages of how it shows up in the population is equal, but diagnosis is not. So much of the research is on young white boys who are hyperactive, and that's not how it shows up for all of us. Saw that. That's not how it shows up for all of us. And I think often, and I say assigned female at birth because there's such also an overlap with non-binary and gender non-conforming within the ADHD autistic community, that I want to be inclusive to everyone, and also identify that when we are kids, how are we being seen and perceived, and how that was being missed because of some of those misperceptions. So with that, I think there's a higher way in which it shows up as inattention in young girls. And we might look distracted or dreamy, or they write it off that way, or, oh, it's a mood thing. So often in the therapy world, what I'll see is somebody will come in and they'll say, I'm anxious or I'm depressed. And we automatically, the brain goes into mood disorders, and we're not assessing for neurological developmental stuff. It just automatically splits. But when boys come in, they're acting out, they're misbehaving, they're struggling with school. So then we go into a cognitive place. And so I see that split, and it's so hard to get people to come back and see how those can be overlapped and interconnected, and how neurodivergence can cause anxiety, which can cause depression, which adds to some of the stress. And that just kind of becomes our own self-talk and our identity, and it snowballs, and then we get stuck in that, and we're masking. And the more and more we mask and we hide ourselves, or we think who we actually are isn't acceptable, it's not enough, or it's too much, and we're just swinging on that pendulum of I'm too much and then I'm not enough, and we're not really finding that middle place. That creates depression. When you can't be your authentic self, we get depressed.
Exactly.
Obviously, right?
And then we have a question in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, really quick. I'm not sure if you have seen this in your practice, because I'm not sure if you restrict to only under 18, but I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, but Leah said, have you come across people who are older than 40 that never had access to any support systems that are neurodivergent? They were diagnosed at age 69, and there isn't a lot out there, and they see the same in the transgendered community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one is just the knowledge and of the diagnosis, and what generation and what that was like. I think some things that we consider neurodiverse now were considered histrionic, or she's just emotional, or it's written off, or whatever that might be in previous generations. And I mean, statistically, women are more likely to be diagnosed after the 30s and 40s. Often we have coping skills. We're able to figure it out. We get through. And at huge life transitions, like I was saying before, symptoms increase. I think about it as I'm carrying a tray and it all makes sense. And then life transitions happens and I trip and the whole tray goes into the air and it all comes crashing down. And now I have to rearrange it and figure it out. And so that can happen going into middle school, going into high school, going into college, getting married, having kids, having your kids move out. And now it's suddenly the system I had in place that was working for me isn't working anymore, or I've burnt out. And so I think there's a combination of us being neglectful of what it looks like in younger women or people assigned as female. We don't see it. And then when we get older, we get to such a distressed place where demanding to be seen. And now more of the research and more of the understanding is available to give an accurate diagnosis. I think it kind of goes along with how with autism, the diagnoses have changed, that there's an increased rate in diagnosing autism, and there's a decreased rate in diagnosing like intellectual disabilities or some of those things, because we're seeing that like it's not a disability, it's a difference. And we're reclassifying things. So now the numbers are skewed because we're actually finding a more appropriate way to identify, to assess it, to name it, and to advocate for ourselves. So I think that it's a multifaceted thing.
Yeah, I've definitely, me myself as an autism researcher, we've seen an increase in cases of autism. And I think that also has to do with like more education on it. So there's more diagnoses, and also with Asperger's syndrome being taken out of the DSM in the United States. And now it's all under autism. So we have a high spike, and people want to contribute that to vaccines or whatever they want to say. But really it's just because fundamentally like mental illness has more, less of a stigma now. And I wouldn't say autism or ADHD is mental illness, but plenty of us have mental illness due to not being diagnosed, or
they're comorbid. They're best friends.
But yeah, so I think it's definitely like a different way of perceiving it, and education, and
I think we're getting more nuanced in how we're able to classify things. And like we mentioned the DSM when we were talking before, and like that's literally just a book of like cluster of labels, that the DSM is not all encompassing, nor is it like an accurate representation of everything that's in it, but it's the medical model, and it's how we can find different labels to make sense of it, to be able to do the research, to be able to get the statistics. It doesn't cover everything. And I think the more developed the research is, the more information we gather, the more specific we can get in how things show up.
Yeah. And then could you also speak about how, like, I see a lot on social media, particularly like TikTok. I don't know if people in this chat room go on TikTok, but there's definitely like a neurodiverse community, and I see a lot of girls or those with ADHD, usually girls, posting videos of like their symptoms, and they're saying like, these are the things that I didn't know were ADHD, but I was just diagnosed. And they'll be like, oh, my sensory problems are so bad that I have like meltdowns. Or like obvious autism symptoms being associated with ADHD. And I guess I just wanted to ask your opinion on that. And also like, I don't know, it's just so hard because I know that like providers sometimes don't know the difference. So I guess how can you figure out the difference, or what do you do in those situations?
One, I love TikTok, and it is such a cool diagnostic tool and like community. And like when I do assessments with my like young adults, I'm like, okay, what's on your TikTok For You page? Like, what are you seeing? Because that'll help me narrow down some of the things going on. But obviously it's a free platform, so there's going to be misinformation on it as well. I don't think autism and ADHD are these separate things. I think it's like a Venn diagram. There's such an overlap in how we process the world, how we process information, that like they're part of the same family. But there's going to be a couple things that are only ADHD that autistics don't have. And there's going to be some things about autism that ADHD people don't experience. But there's going to be a really high overlap in between. And I think trying to say it's like one or the other, you can't really like split hairs like that. I feel like it's the same family. It's just the presentation in me and in you are going to show up different. The same way my anxiety and your anxiety are going to be different. And I think that speaks to that first question you brought up. My brain went blank. What was the second question? It was a really good one too. You just start saying the words, I'm going to get it.
I gotta remember it now too. ADHD brains.
Right.
Well,
it was like kind of how do you tease it out, kind of. One, I think if you can find a provider that is neurodivergent, I think we are magnetic and we are drawn to each other, and we can like find each other across rooms. As I was diagnosed, I started looking at my friends and the people I like really get along with best. And I've been like, dude, this is why we can keep up with each other. This is
Yeah.
what, like, when we do this, like, this is diagnostic. Like, I can't even tell you how many of my friends I've gotten diagnosed since mine. And so one, I think that's a piece, but I also know that that access is really hard. One, if we're not getting diagnosed till our 30s, 40s, 50s, how do we advertise like, hey, I'm neurodivergent, I am affirming, like, let's figure this out. I think one thing I want to do is I want to create a training for clinicians to be better equipped to tease out and assess for some of these things. I did a podcast like a month or two ago with Cal Psychiatry. It's called Mind Stories. And we talked about how to tease out and ask secondary questions in assessments to kind of understand what's fueling it, what's at the core. So what I've often seen in a lot of the like the superficial assessments for neurodiversity is like, oh, do you run late? No. And then they move on and like, oh, okay, then you can't be ADHD. But in my assessments, I say, okay, you don't run late. Awesome. What do you have to do to make sure you arrive somewhere on time? And if somebody has to say to me, well, I put 4 alarms in my phone, I plan it out the night before, sometimes I even drive there ahead of time, and I like often get there half an hour early because like, I don't know if I'm gonna make it on time. Well, that's not just, oh, I just arrive on time. Like, that's coping skills. Those are things that you've learned how to do over time to make sure you can function in that way. So I ask that on everything about like, oh, with your anxiety, what's behind your anxiety? Is it fear-based? Is there something else going on? Or is it, well, I have a hard time in social situations because I can't gauge when it's my turn to join the conversation. So I just stay quiet. Or you know what? I just end up talking over people and I don't know when to stop. Where is the social anxiety coming from? Is it a fear? So like those I would attribute to like neurodiversity of, am I overthinking it? Am I having a hard time tracking or knowing the social skills or knowing how to add my input? As opposed to anxiety would be, they're going to judge me. I'm going to say something wrong and I'm going to hyper focus on being judged. Like, I feel like those are kind of different thought processes. Like sitting here with my puppet. So I think being able to, one, have a clinician that'll ask those extra questions, but also for yourself, if you're trying to go in for an assessment or find a clinician, is you providing some of those follow-up. Instead of just saying yes or no to their answer, saying, well, I arrive on time because these are all the things I had to do to make sure it happened. And that allows you to have that voice of advocacy that says, I've done my research, I know who I am, this is what it looks like for me. And this is why I get stressed out and I'm exhausted because I have to do all these 8 million other steps before I even get to the appointment. And that's where the anxiety comes from. And that's where like the fatigue comes from.
Yeah, definitely. And we know that can be really hard. So me and a couple other members, we created these little like worksheets. We have them for ADHD and autism, but not like learning differences or other disorders yet. But they basically go through each of the DSM criteria that provider is going to look for. And then it leaves like a space for you to explain it. Also because like we have anxiety, like a lot of us have anxiety, I think most, but especially in autism too, with like social situations, like we might forget, like I go blank, especially when I'm really nervous. I don't know this person. So like if you forget to say these things, like you won't be diagnosed. And that doesn't even mean that you don't even have the symptoms. You just can't like speak the right way in the situation. So
and isn't that diagnostic in and of itself?
Exactly, but they don't see it sometimes. So they're just like, oh, you didn't say all these things. And it's like, sometimes they don't ask. And like, definitely with the criteria, with the, like the tests that they give, or just the questions they ask, like being neurodivergent in itself, like you understand things differently than like neurotypicals. So like, you might take a question like completely the wrong way than what they asked.
Yeah.
And like they'll think that that goes as you not having the symptom that they were looking for. It's like, just be straightforward, especially with autistic people. Like, just ask us. Like, don't like go around, beat around the bush. But what
are you asking for so I can give you an actual answer?
Exactly. But I think we have another question in the chat. We have from Jamie. How can you deal with rejection sensitive dysphoria causing you to mask during therapy?
rejection sensitive dysphoria is rough, man. Like that perceived rejection, or that, I think in therapy, if you don't feel comfortable, it is the therapist's job to make you feel comfortable to be honest and direct with them. And if you can't be honest and direct with the therapist, I think there's the question one for yourself, is that your fear and your anxiety, or is it the therapist not creating that space that you can speak up and bring that in? And I want to encourage you, if you share something with a therapist and there is a perceived rejection with like RSD, you say that. I like to give the analogy of like our brain likes to make up stories, like even just like going back evolutionarily, we look around an environment and we try and identify the things that are going to kill us. So I'm going to identify all the negative things, and that's what I'm going to remember. I don't have to remember what's safe as long as I know what's going to kill me. So we look around our environments now and we just identify all the negative stuff because we want to stay safe. So if there's an unknown of, I don't know how to bring this up to my therapist because I'm fear of a rejection, we're going to start making up a story that it's going to be a rejection and it's going to be bad. Because if it's an unknown, obviously it's going to be bad, right? Because that's what our brain is designed to do. So I encourage people to check in. What are the facts? Coming back to the black and white, the facts. What have I seen? What have I experienced? How has this person like responded to me in previous interactions? And not making up a story that's going to induce my anxiety to then keep me quiet or not ask the direct question. When in doubt, just ask.
Yeah.
And I think that's a hard part with learning how to unmask, is there's so much we've learned how to hide or to just keep to ourselves because we've been told not to or to do something. But that's a part of learning how to show up as your authentic self. And that's part of what we're doing in therapy, is how can I practice with this safe person to take my mask off so I can learn out in like in the real world how to be able to do that with other people that I trust. I do want to say something about like diagnosis, is I want to acknowledge that self-diagnosis is also valid, that access to a diagnosis, access to those resources can be really hard to get to, depending on where you are in the country, in the world. Insurance is like crazy. So self-diagnosis is also valid. We are allowed to self-diagnose anxiety and depression and a lot of other mood disorders. Why can't we say, I've done my research, this fits for me, I feel confident that this is something that is real. And in the neurodiverse affirming therapist pages that I'm on, that is more and more encouraged and accepted and validated. Now in the mainstream therapist stuff, that's a lot harder to get across. But I want to say that in here, as much as we're saying diagnosis and doctor's offices and all of that, self-diagnosis is also valid and real. I think with getting a diagnosis or seeking that path, it can depend on like, what are you looking for it for? Are you seeking an actual diagnosis because you need accommodations for school or for work? Okay, then yeah, you got to kind of go the medical route. If you're seeking it because you want or to try medication, yeah, depending on the provider you go to, you may need a therapist or a psychologist to diagnose as well. But if you are just doing it because I want to know for me and I want that confirmation, self-diagnosis is good. And not everybody will agree with me on that, and that's totally fine. But that was something I really wanted to touch on, because getting a doctor who will see it and validate it can be hard. Finding a therapist that can assess for it is hard. Depending on what you want, if you are looking for a diagnosis for, a therapist, a social worker, a clinical therapist can diagnose ADHD. Sometimes a psychiatrist will want there to be testing or want you to see a psychologist. As an adult, you don't need a full neuropsych evaluation the way in which we recommend it for kids. Because when we're doing that for kids, we're wanting to also rule out learning disabilities, other processing, sensory. We want to like really check everything. So if we're going to provide services, we can hit everything. But as an adult, you've already been through so much of life and know yourself theoretically well. you can kind of self-identify that stuff. And second, third, fourth graders don't know how to say, I'm sensory sensitive, right? But as an adult, we can find those words. So they don't have the words to fully describe what's going on in their brain the way in which adults may be able to. So I don't think it's necessary to have a full neuropsych evaluation or psychoeducational evaluation unless you really want one. They're also super expensive. But a psychiatrist may want a letter or a confirmation from a therapist or psychologist or your primary provider to provide medication. Yeah, we can talk about the psychiatrist medication thing, like kind of broadly if we want to go that direction, but I want to check in because I've seen like the chat going off.
Yeah. I think someone did say this like a little bit higher up. They were talking about how to find someone who knows these things about neurodiversity.
Mhm.
And I know you pointed me towards a website that now I have them listed on my site, ndtherapists.com, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
And they have therapists listed in multiple states that are
Mhm.
neurodivergent themselves.
Yes.
I guess my question would be, sorry, it's a double question again. I'll remind you if you need.
Okay, I'm ready.
But,
I'm ready.
I guess it would be, how do you go about finding someone who you know knows about neurodiversity in like the right way, I guess,
Mhm.
and like knows about atypical presentation, and then
Mhm.
also someone who, sorry, my fire alarm's going off.
Oh no.
But someone's cooking. Sorry, I'll ask again. So how do you know you can find someone that is like neurodiversity affirming or is educated on neurodiversity? I guess that's just
I think it might start with, if you're finding them, if they have an online profile or you're on their website, do they identify it? Do they say I work with this, or what is the language they use around speaking about neurodiversity? I also believe that like if you email or you call to like ask for a consult or just a phone call, you can straight up ask that. Hey, I think I might be autistic. What's your experience with that? How do you approach this? What's your way of working around this? Do you have experience in this area? Ask those questions. You have every right to ask those questions. You have every right to go to one therapist and say, hey, this doesn't feel right, and go to another therapist. You do not have to stay with a therapist that you don't feel is affirming to like your brain or kind of helping accept and celebrate yourself. I think those are some initial ways, but it can also be in your first session, you can say, hey, I might need a stim in session, or do you have any fidgets for me? I have a whole box of fidgets that I have sitting out for clients to just like play with. And like, I think we can also tell, like we were saying before, like when you look at your friends and we're all somewhere on the neurodiverse spectrum, you can meet a therapist and kind of gauge that too. Yeah.
if it's
I think
easy
that's
for
the way, but like you said, there's the ND therapist directory. I know there's a really big Facebook group that I'm in for ND therapists, and they're working on a directory. And I think that one's going to be very, I think that's going to be very, have a deep breadth of information and access to people. But I think one thing that's cool about everything switching to telehealth in the last year is you can see anyone in your state. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone in the town or the city that you're in. We do have access to people all across the state that we're in, because therapists can only practice in states that they're licensed in. So I think that's broadened it a little bit, but at the same time, personally, I like in-person sessions more. So I know there's a big back and forth with that too.
Yeah. And then when do you think it's appropriate to like tell your clients that you are neurodiverse? Like, do you always disclose it, or, and also do you tell the parents?
I think I have it. I mean, my Instagram and my TikTok are neurodivergent therapist. So I think like it's pretty obvious right off the bat. I think when I like self-disclose in session, it'll kind of be if I'm assessing for it. Like if they come in and say, we want this assessment, then it's like right off the bat, we're talking about it. But if something's coming in for anxiety or depression, I validate and acknowledge where I like to meet people where they are. So if you're coming into me and you're saying it's anxiety and depression, okay, cool. We're working on anxiety and depression. And if after like 1 or 2 sessions, like I feel like there's maybe something else under the surface, like with a lot of females, I do see that, okay, no, the depression is a symptom of the autism or the ADHD. If I want to go a little deeper, I'll be like, hey, can I ask you a couple of these questions? And I'll do a little bit of assessment questions. And I'll be like, for me, how it shows up is I kind of think this way. Does that fit for you or no? And kind of start to like share some of that. And then when I am explaining things to parents, I'll bring in some of my own experience too. Like, especially when it comes to medication, I like to share that because I know there's a lot of fear around stimulants or other types of medication that can be used to help with the symptoms we experience. And I think medication is absolutely a personal preference. I can talk more about that if that's where interest is also, but
Yeah.
I rarely say you need medication. I'll say, hey, the example I like to give about medication, how it felt for me and what feedback I've gotten from clients is so I'll speak about stimulants first, because that's what's most likely used for like ADHD and a lot for autism, because stimulants are dopamine. And the thing with neurodiversity is we don't often have enough dopamine in our brain to turn on our prefrontal cortex, to turn on executive function, to be able to do things sequentially or to remember something. If we're not interested in it, there's no dopamine being produced, therefore I will not maintain. So if somebody has anxiety and depression, they're most likely given a mood stabilizer, an SSRI, which is serotonin, which it'll help because serotonin and dopamine are the happy chemicals. But if you're giving me serotonin and I need dopamine, it's not going to do very much. So if I've had people come in who've been on multiple antidepressants and it's taken the edge off, but it hasn't really relieved it, that's a big sign to me that like, okay, maybe you need dopamine. So then we start talking about stimulants. And how I describe that feeling is if you wear glasses. If I don't have my glasses on, I have contacts on right now. But if I'm not wearing my glasses, I can still see you. I can still figure out what's going on and I can engage. But I'm going to have to try harder and my eyes are going to get tired and I might have to squint. And since it's blurry, I'm going to miss a detail. But when I put my glasses on, I can see you, I see all the detail and I don't have to try. And that's how I've made the connection of it's not changing me, it's not changing my uniqueness, it's not changing really how my brain works, but it is changing how my brain works. It's letting me see everything clearly and not having to put in the 10,000 steps of extra energy to be able to get the same, if not more information. The stimulants work day one, they work instantly and they wear off by the evening. And so you can choose when and how you take it as opposed to antidepressants that you have to take constantly. But also anxiety and depression are real disorders that we have and experience. And sometimes we need both because they are connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about kind of like the stigma behind the disorders in themselves, but also like medication behind them and like how people might think that, I don't know, like they're just lazy or they don't actually need the medicine or something like that, and how to like deconstruct that?
I saw a really cool meme that said, when someone's lazy, it was an image of someone laying on the couch with like a messy room. And they're like, when someone's lazy, they'll say, I should clean. Nah, I don't want to. When a neurodiverse person is sitting in a room, they'll look around, they're like, I should clean. I need to clean. I want to clean. When should I clean? How do I clean? I don't have the energy to clean. Where do I start? I should be cleaning. But the image you see is both two people just sitting on a couch in a dirty room. But that's where those secondary questions come in about what's going on cognitively behind that. So it may externally appear as lazy, but if you don't have the dopamine to start, you can't. And so that's where I check in with people is, do you have a hard time starting or do you have a hard time staying engaged? And that kind of helps us figure out, well, what skills do we need to incorporate? How do we keep you stimulated versus like, how do we turn on the stimulation? And those can kind of help us treat those pieces of it. But I think like the stigma I hear a lot with that is like, well, you can focus on the things you like. Well, yeah, I'm stimulated. Of course. Like, when parents tell me that, like, oh no, they're not ADHD, they can focus on what they like to do. And I'm like, okay, you just gave me facts that support some of this neurodivergence. Oh, they can hyper focus on that? Like, yeah, okay, duh. So I think teasing that out, I also think with the stigma is, I think in the 90s, medication was just tossed out and not fully understood and too widely spread, that there's a lot of stigma now. I think, especially like for millennials, I think so many boys were just thrown on the medication and maybe overdiagnosed, that there's now this stigma of like, oh, nobody really needs that. Even though there's so much more research and development and understanding and so many more types of medications and ways to use it and how it works, that it's a whole different game. But I think some of that stigma has carried over and rejecting it a little bit. And I think there's unfortunately a stigma with mental health medication in general, when it's just like, if I was diabetic and didn't have enough insulin, nobody would think twice about me taking insulin medication. If my body's not producing it, I need external help. My body's not producing serotonin or dopamine, I need extra help. If my eyes aren't seeing clearly, I need extra help and I put on glasses. I personally don't see any difference.
Yeah, definitely. We had another question in the chat from Eleanor. Do you find a lot of pre-diagnosed ADHD individuals self-medicate with mixed success with caffeine?
Yes. My diagnostic questions: how much caffeine do you drink? What does it do? Do you fall asleep after drinking caffeine? Does it do anything? I think a lot of people self-medicate with marijuana. And I don't think people self-medicate with this, but it's one of my other diagnostic questions of like, have you tried cocaine? If you've tried cocaine and you're like, what's the hype? Like, I don't feel anything. Congratulations, you might be one of us. So yes, we're self-medicating. And we also self-medicate with risk-seeking, adrenaline-seeking stuff, extreme exercise, extreme working out. When I was in high school, I was on 3 varsity teams and 2 club sports. And that's how my brain was self-medicating. How the hell did I have time to do all of that? But it was the only way my brain had enough of what it needed. So I don't know that this is fully accepted either, but I also think self-injury is self-medicating. I think that often that's a signal for me too. If somebody has a history of self-injury, that they were self-medicating, because our brain makes more sense of physical pain than emotional pain. And if I get injuries cause adrenaline, which create dopamine, I feel better for a hot second and then it goes away again. So I like to kind of acknowledge all of that. I see someone wrote, for me, it was food. Yeah. One of my other questions is carbs and sugar. Do you have excess cravings for those? Carbs are churned into sugar in our body. Sugar makes us feel okay for a little bit. Those are all ways that we self-medicate because something externally is out of our control, or internally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I guess, could you just explain some symptoms or ways that those assigned female at birth show up in your practice or when you were giving evaluations for the psychiatrist?
Yeah. So the reason we kind of put that as part of the title for today is I think the presentation can be different, and I think the research and advocacy is lacking. So I like to identify that. I think we kind of said at the beginning too that assigned female at birth, we're taught to internalize things, and we're taught how to be caretakers. So it becomes us. Instead of me hyperactively acting out, inside of my body, there's a lot going on. My brain is bouncing around, my emotions are bouncing around, and I'm containing it all within myself. So it's not externally seen in the same way. I think that's where we also get some of the empath piece of it, of being highly in tune with other people's needs and emotions, is because I have to read your emotions to know how I'm supposed to react. And so that then is put in again to the mood disorder category of like, well, you're emotional, or you're a highly sensitive person, or you feel emotions really strong. Well, yeah, I think like if we feel really strong or really low, and that's kind of how we mask. And that's also a part of like the rejection sensitive dysphoria, or not quite knowing how to gauge certain situations. So the way it shows up in my practice is often somebody comes in, they've seen a number of therapists, they've tried a number of medications, they have a history of self-injury, they might have suicidal ideations, and they might be doing well in school, but they hate it or it's so hard. So there's no red flags at school. And I've even had conversations with psychiatrists of my patients, of them saying, well, they don't have issues in these categories. And I'm like, yeah, but have you asked these follow-up questions? Yeah, they have a whole group of friends, but do you know how they hyperfixate on making sure the friend group stays safe and okay? And that's maladaptive, because that's creating anxiety and distress, and they're not getting to show up as their full selves. So I think it can often be overlooked in that way. I kind of feel like I'm rambling because I lost my train of thought right now. But I think the other piece, so we're talking with like adult and late diagnosis too, is often we appear to be, what am I saying? We can multitask or we cannot multitask. It's like one or the other. And processing my thought.
It's okay.
I think often people come in their 30s, 40s, 50s, kind of checking into this because there's something they've always struggled with, or something always felt a little bit off or more difficult than they thought it was supposed to be, or from what other people have reflected. And so there's a question, there was always this feeling of something's wrong with me then. And really, as they were getting older and you get to know yourself better, you realize, well, yeah, something's off, but it's not that something's wrong with me. It's that I interpret the world differently, or I engage with people differently. And I think as we get older, we stop caring as much what other people think. Not entirely, but we get to a point of like, well, I just want to be happy, and I'm not happy. And why can't I be happy with some of these things in my life? And so we start asking deeper questions to try and figure that out. And hormones. Oh, I can't believe I almost missed this. Hormones are a huge piece of it with women, because so when we're menstruating, estrogen helps produce dopamine, progesterone. So the week of your period and the week before, increase in progesterone decreases the effectiveness of estrogen, which means the weeks of your period, your brain's going to be working even less than before. Your dopamine is even lower. And so that's when we see the emotional dysregulation, the reactivity, the forgetfulness, the irritability. Our ability to self-regulate decreases again. And I think that's another reason why women are then put in this category of being emotionally unstable, as opposed to it being a cognitive neurological piece. And so I think we see a big increase at puberty. I think we see a big increase when children are born. And then I think we see another big increase around menopause, because again, all of the hormones in our body are changing, and therefore our cognitive function is shifting because they're so interconnected. Can't believe I almost missed that one. Thank you for keeping down that path.
Because I've definitely seen that like a comorbidity, at least with autism, I'm not sure with ADHD, is PMDD, I think it's called, which I never knew like the chemical background of that. I just thought it was like another comorbidity to add to the list of autism. But yeah, we have another question in the chat.
Yeah.
Here's a question: is overthinking and overanalyzing a sign of dopamine depletion?
It's definitely, the overthinking, overanalyzing is a symptom of neurodiversity. Thinking of if it's a sign of dopamine depletion. I wonder if it's like a dopamine seeking of like, one of the things I feel with anxiety is if I become anxious, I'm now stimulated. So if it's like, I can't forget this. I can't forget this doctor's appointment. Don't forget it. Don't forget it. Don't forget it. I'm trying to keep it at the front of my brain because my dopamine isn't going to keep it logged there. But then that creates an anxiety. I'm going to forget. I can't forget. You have to remember. Don't forget. Like, do this. And that creates an anxiety, which then creates the negative self-talk of you always forget. Why can't you stay on top of this? Okay, stay focused, stay focused, stay focused. And that's the overthinking, that's the overanalyzing. It also creates dopamine, in my opinion. And I think we self-medicate with anxiety sometimes. Neurodiversity creates anxiety, and anxiety masks neurodiversity.
Yeah.
I think depression might be more connected with dopamine depletion. That would be my initial thought, but I like that question. I'm going to look more into it specifically.
Yeah. I think just personally that like as an autistic person myself, that like I think it comes with autism, the overthinking and overanalyzing, like just because I don't know how to communicate with neurotypicals like at all. So I don't know if it's dopamine that is in this process, but like I am like I'm always like overthinking, like, oh, where do I look on their face? Do I make eye contact? Like, that overanalyzing. And then like, when am I gonna talk? When can I talk? Like, what am I gonna say? Do I have my script? Because if I don't, I'm not saying anything. But so I think that's like a major sign of autism more. I mean, you gotta look at like what the thoughts are, because like certain
Yes,
thoughts are like
exactly.
obvious ADHD thoughts, and then certain thoughts are autism thoughts, and then if you
Mhm.
have both, then
That is
you're just
not true. Who
overthinking all
knows?
the time. You have a lot of anxiety. But
I love the TikTok videos where people are like showing their like autism and their ADHD arguing with each other. I think that's like so accurate.
yeah, I guess that could be another question. Like if someone has, if they're autistic and they have ADHD, do you think that can be easily missed in a diagnostic session? And like, how have you seen like them show up together? Like I guess like at least for me, like my autism comes first, so like if they ask me a question about on the ADHD diagnosis, like I might be like, well, no, I don't have that symptom, but that's because of my autism. So like I guess how do you tether that out?
So I might not be totally accurate on this statement. This is like more of like a personal anecdotal statement of, I think that autism is more likely to have ADHD as a comorbidity than ADHD in and of itself. Like it's more often you'll have autism at the core with the symptom of ADHD as opposed to ADHD at the core with autism symptoms. Does that make sense? So I do believe that especially if you're female and your ADHD is in attention and your autism is highly masked, it absolutely could go missed or unidentified. Or like you said, depending on how a question is answered, like, well, yeah, but that's not the core of it. It's coming from this. And I think that's one thing that's really great with some of these self-advocacy groups, like you've created, to help identify and break down, well, where does the thought go? Helps you have that response or that answer when you're talking to a clinician to say, well, yes, but it comes from this. Like you say, yes, that's a symptom, but it's from being autistic. I think that helps to tease that out. I think depending on how personally symptoms show up, and people's level of familiarity with autism versus ADHD. I think a lot of clinicians have a lot less exposure and understanding of autism and being autistic and how that may present in a variety of ways.
Yeah, definitely. And then I just got a question privately sent to myself. I guess this really has to do with the whole talk about late diagnosis. What do we see in like young girls, like middle school, high school, or even elementary school? What are the signs of autism or ADHD that we can look for now to make sure that they don't go like their whole life not diagnosed?
I think if we're looking at young kids, I think it's being the external things that we can kind of see are like some of the sensory or the stimming, or providing some of the things to let them stim or to let them fidget and see, is this helpful to you? What makes this easier? How are you most comfortable? And helping them be able to label those emotions. I like to give multiple choices that are like, hey, what's going to work for you? Do you want this, this, or this? And that kind of helps identify that there are a variety of options and there's not one way to do it that's right. Also, they let kids be kids. Like, I think we put such a pressure on kids to grow up and stop playing that we don't get to see them fully develop. They start masking so early. I think noticing their emotional regulation. What are the things that dysregulate them? What are the things that help them regulate? That can help us identify what's going on internally, but also give them the language to identify what's going on. I really like Dan Siegel. He's a neurologist at UCLA. He specializes with adolescent brains, and he calls it name it to tame it. That if I can name what I'm feeling, I can have control over it. So if you're with a kid and you're like, hey, are you happy? Are you mad? Are you sad? Are you frustrated? I'm frustrated. Okay, I can name it. Now I can express it. And I don't think kids, they don't know that language yet. They don't know those words all the time. So sometimes we got to help teach them what the words are, but it's giving them options. You pick what you're feeling and not, I'm going to tell you this is what you're feeling. Because I think that's what a lot of us experienced when we were kids, of being told you're lazy, or you're just too upset, or you're just this, as opposed to me getting to say, well, this is what I feel I am, or this is what I'm experiencing.
Yeah. And then we have 2 more questions in the chat, and then maybe we'll allow one more and then we can end. So the first question is, do clinicians still confuse borderline and autism? And before you answer, I'm going to say yes, because I'm diagnosed autism and I've been to psychiatrists that are like, no, you're borderline. So yeah, but you can continue. Maybe just give us some examples of misdiagnoses we hear, including borderline.
I agree with that. I feel like what often happens is, if, let's say, the same symptoms show up in my office, but one's male and one's female, the male may get autism, ADHD, some of these learning disabilities. And if a female presents with the same symptoms, might get major depression, borderline, bipolar, because it's mood. Your mood's dysregulated. So that we're just going to automatically slap that on. I absolutely think if anybody comes to my office with borderline or bipolar diagnosis, I automatically question it. The percentage of the population that actually is bipolar is like 3 to 4%. And the population of autism ADHD is like 13%. So the odds of you being neurodiverse are so much higher than being bipolar. And it's a totally different treatment method. It's a totally different understanding of your symptomology and where it comes from, and your level of control and how you connect with the world is entirely different. So I think if somebody offers you that diagnosis, I question it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And also the fact that neurodivergent females, just being neurodivergent in itself, like, you have trauma by the time you're an adult. So they're going to be like, borderline, because you have trauma. This is your trauma and how it shows up. And it's like, I've had this since like birth. This causes trauma.
Well, there's new conversations and new theories around borderline actually being, that borderline is a neurodiversity, that there's a certain type of attachment trauma that happens to a neurodiverse brain at a very young age that then becomes borderline personality disorder. Borderline is is complex PTSD. And I think if you have a predisposition or a genetic background of being autistic or neurodivergent in any way, and then you have a severe trauma in those early years, there's a higher likelihood of developing BPD. So I do think they're in the same family, actually, but I think the way that clinicians, there's just such a stigma around both, around BPD and around autism, and they're different stigmas, but they are both there.
Yeah, definitely.
I do have a question though. I know we've talked about the topic recently about masking and diagnosis, but when it comes to men, women, or non-binary individuals, when it comes to those classifications into their 30s, 40s, and 50s, is it due to the updated classifications today, or is it due to going back to the topic of masking, or do you feel like it's maybe both? Is it fair to say it's both, in your opinion?
Summarize that. You're asking for men or non-binary and masking in older age, kind of. I don't think I fully got the question.
Oh, yeah. So when it comes to, especially for women being diagnosed later in ages, 30s, 40s, and 50s, Do you feel like it's due to updated classifications for deeming a person as neurodiverse, or do you feel like it's a little bit of masking? I was curious about your opinion on that.
Yes, I think it's both. I think it's updates in classification and understanding, and I think it's coping skills and it's masking. I think we've learned how to cope, and our ability to cope has turned into a mask. And I think we hit a level of an exhaustion of wearing a mask and not getting to show up as our authentic selves. And then the mask crumbles and breaks. Then we go into a place of like, I need answers. I said at the beginning that there's a big overlap with being non-binary or being trans with being autistic. And I think that goes along with like brains process information different and not fitting into the neurotypical brain or processing or society, that there's just a lot more space to show up as yourself. And I think when people start to accept who they actually are, we start showing up in more unique ways. And I think it's really beautiful that there are so many people that are allowed to show up as their full selves. But it's also really hard. And there's a lot of like non-acceptance stuff too. Yeah.
We have a few more questions in the
I'm free to stay on. My next appointment's not till 4. So I'm free to stay on if people would like to keep asking questions. I can stay till 3:30.
Awesome. And then I just wanted to say, with non-binary LGBTQ plus community and being autistic, I think it's I don't know about ADHD, but I think in autism we just don't understand like societal like rules. And I don't want to like discount anyone's sexual orientation or like gender or anything, but like I don't understand it. I'm just like, was this made up? Because I feel like I don't know why. Like I don't understand it at all. And I think a lot of us feel that way. Like I don't want to discount anyone, but I just don't understand any of it. And I'm like, who made this up? Because that's how it feels in my mind. I don't understand any societal like things.
Well, I think especially with autism, we like to know what the rules are. Make it make sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense, I don't want to follow the rules. And the binary doesn't make sense. Gender construction doesn't make sense. So I don't want to follow it. Because yeah.
Literally, like I've always done like whatever I wanted to do. I was never like, oh, this is what girls do, we need to do this. Like I just was like, I don't care, like I like this, so I'm gonna do it. Like I never saw that like societal view of like having to do certain things. Like I just never, even before I was diagnosed, like I never understood that.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, I wonder if that's another piece of some of the late diagnosis of how society is changing, or how much we're Gen Z and millennials are pushing back to a lot of like the social constructs, is if in previous generations that forced conformity and not getting to like live authentically, and what that looked like, or being able to have community, or the way that we're able to have a neurodiverse community on TikTok. Like that didn't exist 5 years ago, you know, let alone 20, 30, 40 years ago, to be able to know, hey, there are other people like me. And I think that covers neurodiversity, and I think that covers LGBTQIA plus, just being able to see yourself in somebody else. Being able to have representation gives you more permission to show up and not have to mask, or not have to hide, or be seen, or be accepted.
definitely, yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people found out about their ADHD or autism from TikTok in this pandemic, or just from the internet in this pandemic. I mean, I found out at the beginning of the pandemic, like the very beginning. I saw some YouTube video was like recommended for me, autism in girls, and I was like, why don't I look at this? And then I was like, what? So then I found out that was me. But like a lot of people will see like TikToks and realize, and they're like, oh my gosh, like this pandemic has like,
well, so here's my theory on why how the pandemic played into that. Our entire structure disappeared. Our entire like, go to school, go home, go to work, go home, do this. It literally disappeared. And major life transitions are super hard being autistic or being neurodiverse. And so we had to figure out all these new systems, and then all of the coping skills we didn't have access to. So literally everything that made it us capable to function, whether it was positively or negatively, disappeared. And we had to like redesign that. So we went seeking. And when you go seeking information, you find stuff. You know, if you didn't have to seek before, or you were too busy, or we were too stressed, or we were too indoctrinated into the system, we don't go looking for it.
Yeah. Especially with TikTok, like TikTok, like finds out like who you are. Like they're like, you liked a video about this, you have autism. And then it shows up like TikTok diagnoses people.
It
It's
is
so funny.
wild. I feel like totally joking, but not. Like that should be one of like the diagnostic criteria. Hand over your phone, let me see your For You page, and then we can help diagnose that. Like whatever algorithm they're using is way more accurate than a lot of systems we have in place.
Artificial intelligence.
I think the online community is awesome. There are so many YouTube videos. There are so many clinicians putting out information. There's so much more, there's so much access right now. And I definitely feel like there's a bit of a surge on this topic, and people having more conversations about it. I don't know if that I'm just so into it, that's all I'm reading anyway, but I do believe like I'm getting a lot more questions. I'm getting referrals from TikTok. People are calling me, having seen some of the stuff I put on there. But also just within my community, people are like, okay, how do I start asking these questions? And I think that's a big part we run into. Something I had written down that I want to acknowledge is the mixed emotion that might come with late diagnosis. Is I think it's a combination of relief and grief. If I'm so relieved to finally have it make sense, and there's something I can call it, and there's things I can read to understand, and it makes sense, and it's not this negative thing. But then I also think there's this compounded grief of like, why did it take so long? Why was it missed? Where would I be if I had known earlier? What would have my life experiences been like if I had started this journey sooner? So I want to acknowledge that, and like, it's both. And two things can exist at the same time. You can be thrilled to finally understand, and you can be upset that it took so long. And I think that there's a whole roller coaster that goes along with that, and kind of figuring out what that looks like in unlearning masking or unlearning past behavior and relearning. How do I want to show up? When are times that I do want to put the mask on? Because you know what? Sometimes we all do put on masks. You know, there's certain situations that like we have to put on a mask because that's just life. But you can also take it off. And knowing when you put it on intentionally, and knowing when you take it off, and who you can and cannot be safe around being your full self.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And definitely like me being like, I don't like look autistic, I guess, whatever that means. But like people have told me that before. I kind of like have to gauge like, and I've been doing this more, and I think this is important, especially if you're autistic, to tell people, even if you don't know them, that you're autistic, if you're struggling in a situation. Like it was very hard for me to like learn to do that. Like if I'm like going to a new college and I'm like, I'm autistic, so this might be hard for me. Like even if they look at me weird, like I'm like standing up for myself, you know, and like it's very hard to learn to do that, and not to think you're like taking the easy way out, or like that, what are they going to think of me? I mean, you get to a certain point, like I was diagnosed like a year and a half ago. I'm now at the point where I'm like, I'm just going to tell people, like, I don't even care anymore. Like I'm out and tell everyone, but I know it's a really hard process.
It absolutely is. I've found the same success in what you're saying of, I meet people and I like tell them exactly like, hey, I'm ADHD, and like, this is the roller coaster we're going to go on. Like either jump in and let's have a good time, or don't get on. And that's totally fine. Like you don't have, like, doesn't mean you have to go along with it. And it helps me weed people out too. Like if this is going to be an issue for you, that's fine. Go on your way. Two different things popped in my head. One was it's going around, and it's, if I'm too much, go find less. If my personality, if my energy, if whatever this is too much for you, that's totally fine. You can go find less.
Exactly.
Because I'm not going to be less of me. And kind of holding that. Yeah.
They're so boring, right? No offense if you're neurotypical in this chat, although I don't think any of us are.
Odds are high. But there's another thing that I've shared recently. I mean, obviously I'm very open about like my process and my experience, and we talked about self-disclosure, but I like to go along with like, I heal loudly so others don't have to be in pain in silence or heal in silence. That like, if I can speak up about my experience and that helps give someone else insight or awareness or just helps them feel seen, then that's worth it. So that's why I do put out the information about who I am and what I go through and what I experience.
Yeah. I think that's like really brave too, to like come out as a therapist and be like, I'm neurodivergent, because you want to help other neurodivergent people. You might
Mhm.
have people judge you, or like, who cares? Because you're helping like your own people, you know?
Exactly,
It's just-
exactly.
It's just so
Yeah.
cool.
It
And I
goes
think,
back to when I started my center, I was like, I want to be the person I needed when I was younger. And so this is a part of it. I didn't know what I was feeling or what I was going through. And I want to help others be able to kind of find those answers and not have to wait 30 years to be happy with who they are.
I think someone's raising their hand. They have a question. You can ask if you.
I don't have a question, just a comment is that I had a lot of regrets, at age 69, finding out, that I was autistic. And I wrote down at 47 that I was trans.
Mhm.
But and I also am very open with people, for the last 20 years that I am trans,
Mhm.
even though I out myself, because it helps other people to talk.
Yes.
And to allow themselves to feel, make it, oh, you know what, I could never talk to anybody about this, but I kind of have some of these feelings too.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for being open about your experience to give people permission to have those conversations with you as well. I feel so often like if we won't say the words or we don't talk about it, people don't know it's okay to talk about those topics with us. And
Yeah.
so I say that a lot with like parents when we're talking about suicide and self-injury. If a parent won't say the word suicide, are you thinking this? Are you having those thoughts? Their kid doesn't know it's okay to go with them with those feelings. If we're not talking about with our friends and family about being trans or being non-binary or being neurodiverse, they don't know it's okay to talk to us about that. So then we're all suffering in silence, not
Eh,
knowing that we're each other's advocates. Go ahead.
It's the same thing with self-harm. It's
Mhm.
like, hey, this is something that I do,
Mhm.
and this is why I do it.
Mhm.
It's like, there's tons of people out there that may be hurting themselves and they just
Mhm.
can't tell anybody.
Mhm.
It's just too
Absolutely.
embarrassing or too personal to do
Mhm.
it.
Unfortunately.
So thank you. I'm enjoying this quite a bit.
Oh,
Thank you.
good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think there's also like socially accepted forms of self-harm, like tattoos and piercings. Like those are okay. And those we do as mental health
Yeah.
things sometimes. And then there's the ones that we've decided aren't as okay. But
Yeah,
aren't.
there's a lot of ways you can fool yourself when you're harming yourself, but I'm not really doing that, but I am doing that.
Yeah.
Endless ways to be creative, to
True.
self-harm yourself. And thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's important too, to talk about. I did a blog post a couple weeks ago about how self-harm or self-medication kind of for ADHD or autism can show up in a lot of different ways, like overworking yourself or substance abuse or like different things that society might judge, and like when in reality you're self-medicating for your disorder that you either knew or didn't know you had.
Yeah. I think one of the clear like the threshold of, is this destructive or is this beneficial? I think that there are ways that self-injury can be soothing. And I think there are ways that self-medicating with caffeine or marijuana works for people. But I think the threshold is the level of distress it may put you in. Does it cause dysfunction actually in your life? Does it stop you from connecting? Is it causing extreme physical harm? Is it destructing your relationships? Because if it's not controlled in some way, then we can go to an extreme. And so absolutely, I support if you are in therapy and you're using any of these methods of self-injury or of self-medicating, checking in with your therapist, because ideally they can hold that space, or they can help regulate it with you, or they can help you gauge, well, what is an appropriate amount if you're self-medicating with food or with alcohol or with any other substances. What is moderation? What is appropriate? When is it affecting your livelihood? Is it affecting your health? Or is it helping you cope with this thing you've been living with for the majority of your life and you've been seeking something?
I think that's just why, for me at least, my belief is it's so important to look into medication, especially for ADHD, because both autistics and ADHD, or anyone who's neurodiverse, is really at risk for a substance abuse disorder. And I mean, I would hate to see someone go down the path of being addicted to a drug or like something life-threatening when they could have just been like on Adderall, and it would have like soothed what they needed. And also because like when you're doing those injurious like behaviors, like it's not actually fixing the problem. Like you need dopamine and you're just going to keep like searching for it, and just to have medication would prevent so much like damage that could happen. And it's just so sad. And then
there's so much research on if kids are appropriately treated with medication at a younger age, their odds of experimenting with drugs decrease drastically. And exactly what you're saying is what I present to parents when we start talking about medication, because then I think the fear is like, well, are they going to be addicted to the medication? And it's like, well, I read something recently is like, how can I be addicted to it if I forget to take it most of the time? How addictive is it? But I think it goes to, if I'm going to be using something, let's make sure it's something that's safe and that it's healthy. And oh no, I forgot. I really liked what you were saying though about being able to identify that early on. If it would just be a pill and that helps me get to a place that I'm not self-injuring or I'm not using substances in extreme, there is a lot of benefit to that.
Yeah, it's just really sad that like, and especially if someone does become like addicted to a substance, I mean, what are the chances they're going to be diagnosed with ADHD? And if they are diagnosed with ADHD, that doctor's probably not going to want to put them on Adderall at that point. And it's just so sad, because if someone had found out earlier, if someone had treated them as a kid and they were on Adderall or on a like drug that would help their dopamine regulation, they wouldn't be in that predicament. And like how they're going to suffer now from their addiction, and they can't get the help that they always needed, because I mean, I don't think the doctor would want to prescribe them that, like, which is sad.
Well, and then we're looking at the symptoms again, right? Substance addiction is a symptom of the core issue. And is the core thing trauma? Is it neurodiversity? And the substance is a symptom of what's going on. And then we're doing Band-Aids again, and we're not getting to the core.
So we talked about the medication, right? And you mentioned earlier, Jamie, about some people not being able to have health insurance because it is so expensive. I hate paying for my own, and I was doing that for a while. But I was going to ask, what other resources do you recommend if you don't have access to one-on-one therapy with a licensed therapist or with a psychiatrist?
It's a great question. Thank you so much. So I'm going to use this as a broad statement because I can't directly recommend this is what any one of you specifically do, because I'm not your therapist and this is just an educational conversation. So I'm just going to put that caveat out there. But if access to health insurance or therapist or psychiatrist is difficult, I mean, caffeine is just one step below a controlled stimulant. So that's definitely something. Being able to look around and see what are things that do increase dopamine. Exercise increases dopamine, and it's thinking about, okay, if I start the day with exercise, it can carry on for me for a couple hours as opposed to ending the day with it. Or looking at when you function best. I'm a night owl. My brain works better at night. It does not work in the mornings. So I skew my schedule to fit that. So if there are times or ways that you can manipulate your structure, your schedule, or when or how you access things, that can be a way to cope with it. I think sensory awareness can be really helpful in coping with it too, of knowing when you're overstimulating, knowing when you're triggered, knowing how to manage through those situations. We don't have enough time right now, but on my YouTube channel, it's Equilibrium Counseling Services. There's a video and it's about the window of tolerance. And I believe the video is called Why We React the Way We Do, but it's a really cool way to like visually picture. It's visual and it's auditory of being able to track your nervous system to know when you're in a place that you have enough tolerance or resiliency or spoons or whatever it may be to engage in certain activities. Those are the ones that come to my head right away. I know that CHAD, that organization, has a lot of free events and workshops depending on where you are, because again, it's not everywhere. I would look around with all these Zoom things that we have going on to see if there are support groups or advocacy groups or coaches, ADHD or neurodiverse coaches that are offering support or skills. Sometimes group therapy is more financially accessible than individual therapy. So that might be another resource. Like the groups that my clinic runs, they're like $30 and it's an hour and a half once a week. It is a group, but you also get some of that normalization of like, yeah, me too. What works for you? Let me share that. And you can go back and forth that way. So that's sometimes more financially manageable. Had another thought. Were those kind of helpful? Was there something else like along the track that you were wondering about or thinking of?
No. Those were perfect answers. I've heard of some of them before, but I wanted to see what you would say in case anyone here within the chat or anyone seeing this video in the future are looking for resources like that. I live around the Houston area, and for the longest time, I was part of Remind Group, and Remind is a nonprofit organization. It's a support group for bipolar, depression, and other individuals dealing with mental illness who need that communication, but also relatability and feel like they could be vulnerable with someone. It took me a few times to get comfortable, but for a while I used to go there. I still deal with depression, and I won't get much into it, but for a while I've been part of that support group, but I still see my therapist every 2 weeks. But I really appreciate your answer, Jamie, in regards to saying or giving out those resources, because I know that it's very hard to afford some of it. I'm a dishwasher, so in no way can I afford health insurance. It's so expensive.
It's so expensive.
Oh yes, but however, I work at a coffee shop, so I get free caffeine. So there's that.
There you go. So caffeine works for 60 to 90 minutes. So if you like pace it out, if you remember, because that's the other piece we tend to forget, that's kind of the thing with like the medications, it can last 6 to 8 hours or 8 to 12 hours. Caffeine is 60 to 90 minutes. So you can use it that way too.
60 to 90. I'll definitely remember that. But I, again, appreciate your answer. So thank you, Jamie.
Absolutely. Seeing the time, I want to throw out a couple other resources. I really enjoy attitudemagazine.com. I think that they have great, really short, really to the point articles that help kind of break down some of the symptoms and the overlap in the presentation and the differences in presentation between gender identities. Like I said before, I was on a podcast called Cal Psychiatry Mind Stories, and we kind of talked a little bit more about this as well. And then coming up in the next month, I'll be on, it's a podcast called Anxiety Therapists, and we'll be talking about specifically the overlap between anxiety and neurodivergence. So those are some things there. Yeah, putting that out there. Honestly, like if anybody has specific questions or they're looking for resources, feel free to email me or reach out. I absolutely love helping people find therapists or appropriate fits, even if it's not with me. Obviously, I can only see people in California, but if you send me a message and you're like, hey, I'm looking for somebody specifically in Houston, I can, or wherever you are, I can put it in some of my networking groups and see if I can find specific people. And I'm happy to help do that. But like Juliet said, we have the ND therapists database, and then there'll be some more coming out that I'm sure she'll keep everybody up to date on.
Yeah. And then I just wanted to say I saw something in the chat about cannabis. And just as a genetics researcher here, I research genetics of autism and ADHD. I just want to say a warning about that, that I think it works for a lot of people, but also that the genetics of autism and ADHD are on the same genes. And those same genes also have schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and other disorders like that. And there is research that shows that cannabis can actually turn on the schizophrenia gene. So I would be really careful with that. That's just like the only thing I'm saying is that like you might have a risk factor. But the cannabis might not work for you, is what I'm saying. You might have a bad experience.
But there's a possibility of more extreme symptoms with it.
Yeah, you may have a bad reaction to it, and it may actually like turn on like a risk factor for schizophrenia, which you probably wouldn't want. But yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. I think it does help a lot of people though, so it's up to you.
It does help a lot of people. I'm gonna let Juliet, I'll stay with what you said, but I would also look at there are different strains and different types of cannabis that help more so than others. Yeah, so that's a piece of it too. Not all of it will work.
Yeah, I've been using medical cannabis for like 3 or 3.5 years, and it's specific strains for different things. And in New Jersey, if you have anxiety, you can get medical cannabis, to treat anxiety. I mean, I see a doctor, basically, can following through on that. So, and you're absolutely correct. Certain drug can make things a lot worse. Like self-medicating, I mean, oftentimes actually goes worse, not better.
It all depends. I mean, some people really like it for their anxiety, but some people.
Well, I think it all comes back to we have different biologies. Yes, we may all have like a very similar like neurodevelopmental structure because we have the similar diagnosis, but we still have different biologies. We have different family histories, and the chemistry in our body is going to react differently to things. Stimulants won't work for everything, and antidepressants don't work for everyone. Cannabis doesn't work for everyone. It's going to be case by case specific.
My kids did not like stimulants. Both of them did not like stimulants at all.
Yeah. There's also like so much more than just Adderall. There's so many other options other than Adderall. That's like the first line, and it's not even always the best. It's the one that most doctors are most familiar with. So that's what they'll throw out first. And if you try it and you don't like it, don't stay there. Like try a different one. There's
Ritalins and was it Concerta or half a dozen other things they went through.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have the coping skills and we feel good and where we're functioning. Like no matter what, something's going to be hard. Even if you're medicated, even if you're not, something in life is going to be hard because the world is set up for neurotypicals. And so if you're neurodiverse, something will always be difficult about it. But sometimes the coping skills you have in place and the way your life is set up, it works. Luckily, I get to be my own boss and set my own schedule. So that makes it work for me. But that's not what everybody's situation is. But maybe you don't feel like you need to be medicated because you're in an artistic field or you have the flexibility or your job gives you the structure you need. We often gravitate towards the jobs, the fields, the life setups that work best for us.
Yeah, I use cannabis with DBT. So it's a distracting tool. So I'm your typical headphones on your ears, listening to music, riding my bicycle. I'm in my happy place.
There you go. Cool. Well, any final questions as we wrap up? I think somewhere it's posted. My website is equilibriumcs.com. My Instagram and TikTok are Neurodivergent Therapist. And if you have any follow-up questions or you didn't want to ask them in the group setting, please feel free to email or reach out. And as we get more information, we'll keep everybody posted.
Yeah. And I'm gonna post all of your socials and your website and stuff with the recording on the website. And then I'll also try to post it on Facebook, a link in my link tree on Instagram.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking to us. It
Thank
was
you
really
so much for
awesome.
inviting me. Thank you for having me in this space to kind of help connect and bring in information.
Awesome. Well, I guess if we don't have any other questions, I guess we'll end here. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.